Hello, and welcome back to our study of the book of Mark. Today we're in Mark chapter 14, verses 1 through 11. So after a long discourse by Jesus, Mark moves the reader along in the narrative by letting us know that the Passover festival was only 2 days away. Jews from around the world would flock to Jerusalem to celebrate in the holy city. And during this time, the population of Jerusalem would just balloon. It would more than double. So from a normal population of about 60,000, it could easily get to over 120,000. So it's quite a big population jump, right? And so this, of course, creates a very charged atmosphere. And we see in this passage that the priests, even though they wanted to arrest Jesus, the priests and the teachers of the law, they didn't want to do any of this during the festival. And that's because it would cause too much commotion. You see, everyone was on high alert. The Romans were out in force to keep peace, right? The Roman governor had come from Caesarea, and he would be in Jerusalem during this time to oversee everything and make sure everything was chill. But turns out this backfires on them, as we will see later. So now Jesus leaves the temple. He's spoken against it. He gave this long discourse. And now everything about Mark's story is leading the reader towards the cross. So remember, the key question of the second half of the book of Mark is, what kind of Messiah is Jesus? Now in this story, Jesus is back in Bethany, and the stage is being set for the pinnacle act of Mark's gospel. So let's read the passage. Now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and to kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot. While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages, and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. "Leave her alone," Jesus said. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. This story is familiar. There's a very similar story in the book of Luke. And in Luke, it's the home of Simon the Pharisee, and the woman who anoints him with perfume is a sinful woman. But we're not reading Luke, we're reading Mark. And we need to remember that the authors of the Gospels were each writing with their own purpose to communicate a message. So the differences between Luke and Mark, they don't have to be reconciled. Instead, they need to be taken within the context of each author's book. So let's look at Mark. Mark doesn't tell us anything about Simon except that he was known as Simon the leper. Now we can presume that he's been healed because he's living in his home in the middle of town. He's welcoming guests in his house, and lepers were generally outcast. But who is he? Is he a leper that Jesus healed? Could be. We don't know. Mark doesn't say. But he's hosting Jesus in his house. Now Mark doesn't tell us about the woman either. He doesn't tell us she was sinful or anything. He just says she's a woman, doesn't even give us her name. He focuses, though, on her extravagant act. She brings an expensive jar filled with expensive perfume and breaks it to pour over Jesus' head. This is an act of anointing, like when they would anoint kings. When kings were anointed, oil was poured over their heads. Now, also in that time, it was just customary that when you had visitors to come in, you would have someone wash their feet, and then you would give them a nice smelling perfume that they could rub on their hands, their arms, and their hair. And they still do this in some parts of the world, in fact, and it allows the person who's been coming off the street to freshen up, and it's a show of welcome, of hospitality. So we don't know exactly why the woman did this. Was she trying to anoint Jesus as the Messiah, or was she just trying to show him welcome and courtesy? But maybe she didn't even know what she was doing, other than she knew there was something special about Jesus and she wanted to give him the best she had. We don't know what her reason was. Now, the disciples aren't happy about it. Why would she waste such an expensive resource by pouring it on Jesus' head? It was worth more than a year's wages, which could have been used to give to the poor. Now, before we're too harsh on the disciples, we need to remember that it was customary to give alms to the poor at the Passover time. And I don't think it would be such an uncommon thing for us today if we see someone. In fact, I see memes like this on the internet where they talk about how like churches, do these things, but they don't give to the poor, which isn't really fair. But you see that people kind of still make this comparison. Now, the disciples, they thought it would be more spiritual to sell this perfume and give the money to use for the poor. And maybe it's not what this passage is getting at, but it seems to me that sometimes Christians they get caught up in trying to live in a way that they think is spiritual, but then they forget to enjoy the good gifts that God has given them and to enjoy just the presence of Jesus. I've seen that. Maybe you've seen that. They're just so caught up in looking spiritual and acting spiritual that they forget to enjoy Jesus. But anyway, Jesus tells the disciples to leave her alone because she has done something beautiful. She has anointed him for his burial. Now, I don't think the woman understood that, but Jesus tells her this is why she really did it. And she did it before he was dead. She is preparing him for where he is going. So Mark is foreshadowing where this story is headed. Now, Jesus makes a statement here that people have twisted for centuries. He says, "You will always have the poor, and you can help them whenever you want." Now, some people have taken this to mean that there really isn't anything that we can do about poverty, so don't try. And others have used this just an excuse not to give. The poor will always be here. I can give them whenever I want. But I don't think that's what Jesus was getting at with I don't think he was getting at either of these ideas with what he said. So I don't think this is what Jesus is saying. In fact, the opposite is true. For one thing, we know that caring for the poor is something the church has always done throughout history. Honestly, no one or no organization has done more to help the poor throughout history than the Christian church throughout the centuries. And so when you hear these critiques about, the church doesn't help the poor, it's not accurate. The church has done more to help the poor than anyone or any other organization ever has. Now, but that doesn't mean that the church won't always have the poor. The church will always have the poor to serve. The church will always have a ministry among the poor. You'll always have the poor. Why? Because that's where you're going to be ministering. That's where you're going to see needs, and you have compassion and you have love for people. Remember, love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. So when you see your brothers in need, the church is naturally going to gravitate there. So the church is always going to have people in need. But this woman has stopped, and she has recognized the presence of Jesus. And he says, you're always going to have the poor to serve, but you're not always going to have me with you. So give Jesus the glory and the praise he deserves. In a way, it's like Jesus is saying that helping those in need will always be the work of the church, but the church cannot forget about him. It's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength first. Second, love your neighbor as yourself. So in dealing with what is second, don't forget what is first. Across the United States, there are hospitals called like the Methodist Hospital or the Baptist Hospital or the Presbyterian Hospital, etc., Catholic Hospital. These hospitals were all started by churches in order to care for the sick and to share the love of Jesus with them. But you know what these hospitals have in common now? None of them belong to any of the churches, and none of them are used for the glory of God. They're just now businesses providing health care, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But it seems that somewhere along the way, these ministries that they got so caught up in their mission that they forgot about their purpose to love and to honor Christ. So, finally, we see that this woman is kind of like the widow who gave her last 2 coins in the temple. She's a foil to the greed of Judas and the priests. The Bible tells you actually a number of how much the perfume is worth. I think it's very interesting because the Greek translation says, instead of it was worth more than a year's wages, it says it was worth more than 300 denarii. A denarii was the normal pay for one day's work. So this bottle is worth more than 300 days' work. Now the number, 300. The woman pours out this expensive perfume. No doubt this is her most valuable possession. Anything you have that costs a year's wages is at least one of your most expensive and valuable possessions, right? And she pours this out to worship Jesus, worth more than 300 denarii. On the other hand, Judas wants to betray Jesus for 30. She'll pour out 300 to honor Jesus. Judas will take 30 to get rid of Jesus. Jesus said that wherever the gospel is preached, this woman will be remembered. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about this woman and how she extravagantly worshiped Jesus by pouring out the best she had on him to prepare him for his burial, which was for us. His death was for us. And we're left with the question, will we give our riches because of our love for Jesus? Will we pour out what we have for him? Or are we going to pursue riches at the cost of having Jesus?